I kind of use the ontologies and taxonomies as opposed to just hierarchical aspects. Taxonomies themselves need to be managed. In the absence of them being managed, they get defined and they get lost as an artifact and they don't really get embedded anywhere. If you define a taxonomy and ontologies, you should embed those into your culture, your recruiting, your training, and everything else. And the mechanism should reinforce it. I would consider the taxonomies to be a product, which means a product has customers. So you might have owners of the product and the people will be able to manage it, but you have a community and feedback mechanisms around it to evolve it. Nothing's perfect and everything changes all the time. I would define taxonomies and ontologies as products with customers and treat them as such with open feedback mechanisms and loops and culture so people can contribute.
Hello everybody, welcome back to the Boundaryless Conversations podcast. On this podcast we meet pioneers, thinkers and doers, and we talk about the future of business models, organizations, markets and society in this rapidly changing world. Today I'm joined by my regular co-host, my colleague at Boundaryless, Shruti Prakash, who is joining from Indonesia. Ciao Shruti.
Hi.
As you know, on this podcast we often discuss product centricity, product-centric operating models, and today we are joined by an authority in this space, Craig Strong. Craig is a product operating model specialist. He leads a global practice on these and other topics at AWS, Amazon Web Services. Craig spent many of the last few years helping organizations transform, modernize, and adopt these kind of customer-centric and product-centric models. Craig is also co-author of a book called The Lean Product Lifecycle, a book and methodology, an award-winning framework for corporate innovation and innovation culture. And the portfolio of customers that Craig has been working with includes lots of very interesting companies, Fortune 500 like Sky or Now TV, Person, Insight Software, and Hairgraves Lansdowne. Hello, Craig. Nice to have you.
Hi, thanks for inviting me to join.
Instead of just telling people what you are up to, Craig, maybe it's a good idea to ask you to tell us more about your professional evolution. And especially, I'm interested in understanding why you ended up in being so focused on product centricity, which is a so hot topic today.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that introduction. So it's an interesting, I guess, answer to your question. I don't think I ended up where I am by design. I think it was an insatiable curiosity and maybe a determination of why and continuous improvement. So some background, I actually started my career as a software engineer. As I started sort of going up the ranks through software engineer managing teams, I started noticing we were building a lot of features that never get used. Then I transferred more into agile to get closer to the customer and sort of build in increments and learn by iterating with customer feedback. And that actually then helped me bridge into product. So then I was looking for repeatability and then how do I actually better understand customer segments, market segments, and repeatability. I basically started realizing that when you go into larger companies, or any company to that matter, the product managers and engineers don't build products alone. You basically have everyone and every function essentially is building products in the organization. Everyone has a role to play. So to actually then develop and scale products, you need to look at the business as a whole and the organization and culture and those things. And that's where I determine, in some extent, what the product operating model is. It's everyone working together to deliver a repeatable value to customers. And that touches on things like innovation as well, because you need innovation, presumes that ideas come from everywhere and you have a systematic way to bring those ideas to customers and learn and develop those things. I ended up in that space through starting out in software engineering and then sort of migrating into wider organizational leadership roles. I ended up at my time at Pearson, I ended up as a VP of Product Lifecycle Management, which was really interesting, looking at products at every stage of the lifecycle and then funding models and worked with CFOs and so forth to understand, well, how do we take a venture capitalist approach in enterprises as opposed to a budgeting model for different products at different stages and those things. Yeah, and that led me to eventually join AWS. All our customers are obviously cloud driven and or cloud enabled at very different stages of their adoption. But when you look at what customers are trying to do with cloud, they're ultimately trying to drive top line or top line revenue or bottom line efficiency. And that brings in, well, it's not just technology, but you have to think about how everyone works together to deliver value. And that's, again, where the product operating model comes in to maximize the value of technology in those contexts.
You managed to touch on so many interesting points just on the opening question. So, for example, you said product centricity as a way to think about the customer, right? That's a very important point, because sometimes large organizations end up more focused on their processes than the customer itself. So product centricity helps keep everybody accountable to the customer, because product and customers are the two topics, two ideas that are very much connected. Then another thing that you mentioned that I think was very interesting, finance, the role of budgeting, and you said kind of transitioning into a VC operating model, so basically investing into ideas instead of budgeting, which is, I think, another fantastic point to bring up, and it very much resonates with the work we are doing with Rendan Hoey and the trio model that kind of push the organization to think about a venture building organization. Having said that, maybe another kind of quick question that I would like to ask you is to help us frame a bit the conversation we are having today. And maybe what I would like to ask you is to give us an overview of the key tenets or the key concepts that exist in a product-centric organization, and what are the key artifacts, for example. No, I'm thinking of portfolios, taxonomies, particular elements of the culture or structure or organizational processes. Let's try to give an overview, and from this overview, then we can peek into some of the deepest or go more vertical into some directions.
So you touched on a good point. So I use the word or the phrase product operator model a lot. And what I find when I speak to customers, there's certain phrases: product operator model, innovation, transformation, and they mean different things to different people. So I like to usually define those things. So when I talk about product, a product for me is any entity which can create repeatable value to a customer or customer segment, I should say. But when I say a product operator model, I'd like to just call out a key value point underpinning that is customer centricity. Because one of the things I'm challenged with sometimes is I go into organizations, they might have a very sales-centric way of working, which is sales-led, which doesn't necessarily lend itself well for efficiency a lot of the time, for repeatability, because it can be very short-term thinking driven by incentives. Similarly, when I see product, I find it challenging because I think if you look at product management for the last 10 years, it implies customer centricity. But a lot of people still see customer versus product centricity, and I don't call that distinction. I think modern product companies are customer centric. So the value or the tenet of customer centricity is through the entire organization. What that means is you actually know who the customers are, you work very closely with the customers, and you use data and feedback from customers to make objective decisions strategically and tactically. So if we were going to look at sort of some of the tenets, I suppose, underpinning that, I would say, or product operator model, obviously customer centricity, as I've just mentioned there. But the other thing would be you've got a connected organization. So I work with customers to try to define, well, you've got the executive group, you might have a business unit, and you might have a product line, and then you've got the program level, and then you've got the product teams. Well, all of those things are connected through aggregation and taxonomies and portfolios, which I'll come to in a moment. And you've also got, the notion of, if you've got customer-centric metrics and a customer-centric culture, you move away from projects. Projects still exist in a product world. I'm not saying they don't exist, but at the same time, they're in the context of outcomes, and that you don't deliver projects because I believe a product is born when a project's delivered, and that's not conducive of feedback loops. So you need a connected organization, you have the cultural aspects, and you need the mechanisms to be able to actually make all that work. Key mechanisms for me are a portfolio at those levels. You have an executive company view of a portfolio. you have business unit level portfolios, and you have product lines and potentially programs as well of a portfolio. But you also then need a key point is a life cycle context. So going back to what we explored earlier about funding and everything else, a life cycle for me is really important because you're able to contextualize the right questions at the right time. And if you get that wrong, you could dismiss really good ideas too early, or discover you're developing the wrong things too late. So if you cross-section a portfolio with a life cycle, so you know where your products are or ideas are at different stages, you can introduce incremental governance in a way where you can maximize learning and develop a culture of learn fast and quick decision making. At the same time, what's also important there is the mechanisms of portfolio taxonomy and the life cycle provides you with objective criteria of what's underperforming, not just performing well. And to free up capacity to innovate, that should give you the ability to decide to say no quite often and to actually close things down or remove duplication from your portfolio. And that allows companies to potentially innovate without increase in spend because you're recycling resources and recycling investment.
You said these are the tenets. You have to have a portfolio. A portfolio can be made of product lines. And so the idea of a portfolio, just to make it clear for our listeners, is a way to look at the system of the products that you develop in your organization. So in a way that you are aware of the complexity. And there are several approaches to this, but essentially, as Craig said, we're talking about understanding product lines and products and sub-products and things like that. Then you mentioned, Craig, that there needs to be an executive view, so a strategic view of this portfolio. Then you mentioned two more things. One thing is taxonomy, and this is something we're going to dive deeper, I think, because at the moment is one of the bigger questions that we have on our table. And then you mentioned life cycle. And I think one thing I wanted to underline for our listeners is you said you need to have an incremental governance. So may I ask you to clarify a little bit, but what I perceive is that maybe initial projects, so products that are still in exploration phase may need lighter governance than projects that are more mature in the pipeline. Am I right?
Yeah, that's right. Let me give you some examples around this, I suppose, where when I go into enterprises, more often or not, to get an idea off the table, you need to write a business plan or something of that equivalent. And that can be quite a substantial undertaking. The business plan, requires investment, and you need to do things like financial forecasting and everything else. Now, if you're doing true innovation, you don't really know the revenue. And anything you project on the revenue is a wild guess. But as soon as you put it in a plan, those wild guesses they get perceived as assertions, not assumptions. So if you put in the context of this is an idea, we're exploring this idea, and you focus upon customer engagement, you focus upon the customer problem, you can learn about what the best business model is through that process as opposed to predefine it in the business plan. So you might actually take months of customer discovery and customer engagement to understand if you're really solving the problem before you even think about revenue, because that would be too early. Now, that's not to say you don't do any research at all, because you wouldn't want to go into a space where there isn't a potential return on investment, because there's obviously a cost to that exploration. But you can do market research to see what's the category, how much people are spending in this, what is the customer segmentation and market look like. So there's some indication that there is a potential return on investment. You just don't know the specifics at that time. So as you learn and ideas move through the different levels of the life cycle, you can start introducing more information contextually into the next stage. And that also allows you to stop things. So if you're spending a couple of months exploring an issue with a small team, and actually you don't meet the success criteria, you're not solving the customer need, fine, then that's great. You've spent less time doing all that planning, and you can move on to the next idea. The other thing, just to point out though, which I think is a real constraint that not too many people talk about enough, is the notion of how alienating traditional governance can be for innovation and ideation. So what I mean by that is most companies I work with are enterprises these days, and they are usually globally distributed or have quite a substantial breadth of employees across different regions. And innovation shouldn't be made exclusive to a group of innovators or those people who are politically connected to the budget holders, because that will constrain the ideas substantially. So having a life cycle which is very simple, so anyone with an idea and those closest to the customer can actually capture their idea in a very simplistic way and actually get that in the portfolio and with support without having to be trained in an MBA or business plans, you're more likely to get an increased quality and an increased number of ideas to actually explore and exploit for your future business health.
What is a product taxonomy? Because maybe a lot of people understand what a life cycle is, what a portfolio is, or portfolio, many products, life cycle, the steps, from exploration into more mature. But what really is a product taxonomy?
Yeah, good question. So it's quite funny, actually. When I talk about taxonomies and life cycles, usually people are not engaged until they realize what they are and how powerful they can be. So for me, a product taxonomy is a simplistic categorization and hierarchy of how things relate to each other. So that means you would have, as we've said, a customer-facing product, and you might classify that as such, or customer-facing platform. And within that, you might have many platforms and internal products, which all make up part of that. And you might have services and everything else, which are all part of that. So it's the hierarchical relationship between those things. And it's really important to make that classification, because when you look at a life cycle or portfolio, you look at it from a lens or a layer from the layer of the taxonomy. And when you've got a taxonomy in place, let's just say you've got an internal service which serves many products, you're able to look at the attribution and inheritance and the total cost of ownership with much more clarity. And you're also able to call out dependency, because if you've got this relationship between which services relate to which products and platforms, you can actually understand, like I said, what the cost is, what the dependency is, what the release cycles are, what the investment is, where the risk is, and what the operational structure looks like. The other thing around it is I think it actually drives behavior. So as I said, it's essential for portfolio management because you look at the level. But let me give you an example. So I was working with a retailer recently in the UK, and I was looking over their taxonomy and their portfolio, should I say, over the last 12 months. And they had a taxonomy in place. But when you looked at the portfolio, there was an increase in platforms. So they had quite a lot of waste, observable waste, and not really much clarity on, if you ask the question, what does this do and what problem does it solve? It wasn't really clear who the customers were. And there was a spike in the number of platforms over the last 12 months for some reason. And when we investigated that a little bit further, the reason being is because by classifying something as a platform, you could bypass a lot of the governance. So whereas a product would go through the life cycle, and you'd say, who's the customer and what this thing, a platform in this company was an internal facing product, and you could get away with defining a lot less on those things. So it created a problem for them, because products were then being defined as platforms to get through. Probably most of them were passion projects and things like that, which made it very difficult to close down and then diluted the portfolio into a meaningful artifact.
You mentioned two things. You mentioned products and platforms, which is a common and recurring element of taxonomy. So, for example, we can recognize them also in many DevOps frameworks emerging. So, for example, if people listening are familiar to team topologies, there is this idea of platform teams and stream-aligned teams. So we kind of see this resonance. But the question I have is more like, if you want to double click into what else do you normally have in taxonomy, or what are the patterns that you see more often? Concepts such as modules, sub-products, bundles, anything else that is worth mentioning before we move into deeper considerations?
So actually, when I was at Pearson a few years back, we were actually implementing the product lifecycle. And we realized pretty quickly you couldn't really implement the product lifecycle or a portfolio without defining the taxonomy. And it was very difficult because Pearson at the time went through a lot of M&A, and we had, it was things like the Financial Times was part of their portfolio, which is very different to some of their educational businesses. There was also the complexity, as you said, of bundles and things like that. So what we ended up doing is defining the SKU. The the single sellable unit, whether it's a bundle or a separate product, as the lowest common denominator for a customer-facing product. And what we're able to do with that then, if you're able to sort of say, well, this is a book, for instance, and that's a product. This is a course, which is bundle of different things. This is a platform which sells many products. All of those are SKUs, they're sellable items. And then you have bundles, and you're able to sort of see the inheritance that way of you can sell this independently, or it's part of a bundle, and that bundle can be part of a platform that way. And then you can create those relationships to know the total distribution in that form as well.
I think one of the points that, sort of stood out to me as well was the fact that inherently organizations are complex and increasingly so, right, with time. So a lot of the inputs that you had said before this as well, in terms of its complexity, the need for governance and so on, how does that hold true when organizations are extremely dynamic, growing in size? And how do you ensure that your systems of operation are kept up to date and constantly so? How do you go about that?
It's an interesting question. So organizations are complex, and you don't need to be a big organization to be complex. What I think, though, when I look at, I work for AWS, which is obviously part of Amazon, which is not a small organization by any means. And one of the things which works well for us to scale is we have a bunch of leadership principles and tenets which drive behavior. And that gives us flexibility because, our number one is customer obsession. So when we're having debates, we will default to, is it the right thing to do for the customer? And that will drive some of the behavior. The important thing is we have common mechanisms, and it's not just Amazon. This is, large organizations I've seen perform well. They have cultural tenets which drive behavior and call each other to account. You have common mechanisms, so there are ways to interface. If you've got an idea, this is how you submit it. If you've got this is a taxonomy, and this is how things are related to each other. If you are at this stage of the product, this is how you manage it, and this is what the team looks like. Or in our case, we have the notion of two pizza teams, which are small autonomous teams which have clear ownership of things. So those things hold true. What I think doesn't work, and what can be a massive inhibitor, is prescription of defined frameworks. Because if you try to prescribe a way of working in a too detailed fashion across a range of an organization which has complexity, you won't cater for the difference and cater for emergence. And I think emergence and difference are absolutely key ingredients for innovation and performance and continuous improvement to prevail. So it's balancing using heuristics, using tenets, using mechanisms to reinforce the cultural tenets, but not over prescribing the ways of working and allowing for difference. And how you do that is, you can have commonality through interfaces, but you can have autonomy within the teams or products behind those interfaces.
In the scalability element, what is the role of P&L, profit and loss, and in general, wrapping finance around products and teams, and also of other elements that are more about circulation of information, like visual documents or communities of practice, like rituals. Staying in the original question from Shruti on how do you scale these? How do you ensure that this approach stays stable as your organization changes? You had new people come in, people go out, and so on. What is the role of finance, P&L, and documentation, community of practice, processes, and so on?
Yeah, so let's dive into that. So I think there's a cultural aspect. How do you maintain the culture and things, which hire slow, fire fast is a good way to protect the culture, but that's not always possible if you're growing fast and all of those things. I prefer to sort of make it focus more on hire the right people, hire based on principles and culture, and skills are trainable. So hiring the right people and taking them on the journey and giving them the support that's needed is absolutely essential. Support can come in the form of formal training, but also communities of practice, mentorship and coaching and all of those things which have their place. The P&L is interesting because it depends what level you're asking the question at, I suppose. Everything we do is to drive customer value, and inherit from customer value, there is a business model. So if you take money as a byproduct of value, then you can focus on the customer and you can work out a business model that way. Now, it has to be sustainable. You can have an inoperable business model, but it's a business model. So the P&L, you have to have minimal thresholds and things like that of what need to be in the interest of the strategic view of the company, and the P&L informs strategy. But I think there's the context aspect of the P&L as well. So not put in financial projections too early, as we mentioned in the life cycle, but actually then having those support of when it comes in, what does it look like, and having the capability to inform and experiment with business models is absolutely key. A challenge I see sometimes is particularly if finance is abstracted from product. So you get product, not necessarily from a finance background, or many product managers haven't worked closely or with finance, but they then define the customer behaviors and everything else, and they might not be able to sort of see the financial opportunities that could be there because there's an abstraction to finance, and vice versa. Finance are prescribing things to product or the part of the business model, but they're a few layers removed from the customer. So bringing those things together, I think, is absolutely key, and that's where what governance for me does. Governance is not a controlling mechanism. It's an enabler to bring people together to have those meaningful conversations, to drive meaningful decisions. So I think the P&L shouldn't be a reactive aspect. It should be a very inclusive aspect, very close to product and the customer. And that's an evolutionary relationship through the product, through its life cycle. And it should also be aspects of that where, mature products can look for adjacency and drive more growth in different areas as well.
What are other indicators that you can use as alternative to P&L, for example, in the early stage of development of a new product unit?
Yeah, so it depends on your product, I suppose, but you want to look at things like customer retention, you want to look at activation, referrals, you want to look at how you're solving the problem for the customer. I actually recently spoke to a VC on this, with a startup looking to get investment, and it was quite interesting. The advice was, don't come to us basically pitching that you want funding. Come to us and show us that you've got at least 10 customers using your product on a regular basis and you're solving that problem for them. And then we'll talk about, financing. So it was very much, we'll work out the business model after, but first thing we want to show you is, you'll show us is that you've actually solving the customer problem. They're frequently using the product over other alternatives, and they're highly engaged. So it's basically demonstrating you can solve the customer problem well enough they choose your product over other alternatives.
I think some of the words that you mentioned, I wanted to highlight and maybe, question you on that as well. That one was that people, let's say, experiment with business models, right, essentially. And the fact that increasingly so we need to be maybe inclusive and not reactive in our approach and so on. Essentially, all of this is done by people on ground, and therefore there ought to be some amount of bias in this process. And maybe, like you said, like hiring the right kind of folks and so on is something that is a step that Amazon maybe takes towards this. But do you have any other recommendations on how this process can be made objective, essentially, and removing any form of bias from the process?
Yeah, sure. So it goes back to the life cycle and portfolio somewhat. So just to clarify as well, so in my role in Amazon, I help customers adopt some of the mechanisms we've just talked about, but are not Amazonian mechanisms, although they might be referenced as models. But I believe, Spotify have the Spotify model, and if you're not Spotify, find your own model. Amazon have their model. If you're not Amazon, find your own model. Amazon didn't use someone else's model. You can still be inspired by and take ideas from anywhere. So don't. That doesn't mean don't use it, but try to evolve it and contextualize it to your business. I think. To objectify the governance, one of the things which is key, goes back to the product lifecycle and the portfolio again, is to define sort of key questions you need to ask at certain stages. So when I the product lifecycle book I mentioned was an example of that, where, when you're in the explore stage, which is after you've submitted an idea, you basically want to focus upon the customer problem most of all. So it's what problem are we solving, and before you even build anything. And to support that, what's been successful for me in the past is actually setting up the notion of product councils. So these, these can be cross-functional groups where you have someone from finance, you might have someone, someone from product, you have someone from technology and architecture, who come together on a bi-weekly or monthly basis to review the health of the portfolio. And then you can have hypothesis-driven design. So one of the things you need to get over is reactive governance, or reactive attribution. So we're building a product, we're going to drive growth by X%, and then you hit like 8%, and then you say that's successful. But what I think for objectivity, you need to say, right, in the next quarter, we're planning to move the needle of Y by 10%. And you should be held account to that 10%. Now, it's not the end of the world if you don't hit it, but you should reason to why. It could be the new competitor product come out. It could be you didn't do this. It could be you assumed something else, but you learned something else. So having a forecast hypothesis of what you're trying to do and how you think it will result in something, and then having the portfolio group come together to review what actually happened and look at the narrative underneath that of the why, helps inform. You look at the metrics, but it also gives you contexts of the why to be able to make a decision. And why that's also important is because you will be able to contextualize decisions, but make better quality decisions, because you're able to sort of observe the detail of the outcome in a more lateral way, I suppose. And that exploration can yield to improved innovation, because you could also see opportunities which are not in your plans, which are learnings you might pivot towards, which could fundamentally be very different to what you started with, but are very important and great opportunities to explore.
We are used to think about innovation as something that is extremely inorganic and comes out of radical ideas and entrepreneurship. So what is the amount of operationalization that we can achieve on something like product innovation? And as a side note to this question, how do you avoid essentially this process to become just innovation theater? And more specifically, what is the role in your experience of skin in the game in this process? At Boundaryless, we are very much big proponents of an approach that involves P&L from the very early stage, if not from the start. And we talk a lot about skin in the game through maybe equity, shared equity, revenue, access to percentage of the profits. So how do you, on one side, empower teams to avoid theater, and also on the layer of those that coordinate and decide, how do you improve their skin in the game in this process?
Yeah, good questions there. So the first thing, innovation theatre. There's a lot of opinions on this, but share in mind a couple of things I think are important there is that any innovation you do has to be connected to a strategy. It might be an innovation thesis or a strategic objective, but ideating without a connection to a strategy or an objective becomes, or runs the risk of becoming pure exploration, pure play, really, which is not always a bad thing, but it doesn't really result in positive results as I see it. I worked with a team a few years back. There's a whole division, and they would just experiment with Google Glass and all of those things. And I can honestly say out of probably 100 ideas they'd done, maybe one went to market, and it was by accident, not by design. If you're able to connect any effort to the strategy and link it in the portfolio, as you mentioned, bring the P&L in. What is it we're exploring? Why and how? How does this connect to the initiatives of the business? Then you're able to get the right support and the right context involved with it. The other thing is, I think there are. If you look at personalities, there are people who are really uncomfortable with the unknown, and there are people who are not comfortable with the unknown, but they're much more comfortable in processes. And So that means there's people who are really good at the left side of the life cycle, the ideating, who are not so good at the right, and vice versa. So understanding who plays where and what their skill set is really important. So there's a cultural aspect of recognizing that as well. But I also would say that innovation is not exclusive to people with innovation in their title. I think, like I said, ideas are cheap, and anyone and everyone can have ideas. But at the same time, if you limit that to people with innovation in the title, you're probably taking 99% of your opportunities away from potential opportunities. So removing the exclusivity and the elevation of, reputation of I'm an innovator, I think is important, to be able to commoditize that a bit more and allow people to lean in and get their ideas heard. And this also stems into the diversity and inclusion and all of those aspects as well. So it's not an exclusive group of people, but it's actually ideas from everywhere. So that's important, I think, in terms of removing the innovation aspect.
How do you ensure that there is a skin in the game for everybody involved, and both the entrepreneurs, the product entrepreneurs, and the leaders that allocate capital into this?
Yeah, so I think there's a personal aspect to this as well. So if there's a lot of great ideas which started in large enterprises that never got pitched to the enterprises because they were on salaries and they get no reward for it. I think there is definitely a place if large enterprises, I think if you speak to most people in roles, particularly around product and technology, they've probably got some side initiatives or big ideas that they're not capitalized or not realized, but they're thinking about them all the time. But there's an aversion to pitch it because it's not really what they're doing in their day job. There's not really a mechanism to support it and everything else. So if there was a way to incentivize people to get skin in the game, as in a reward system. So if they pitch something, and I don't mean like a prize system, I'm on about equity in it. It would incentivize people to go over and above their day job and connect to it and bring their ideas forward in the organization they're in. Then to be able to do that, you'd need the governance to recognize it. So, could people be seconded? Could they be rewarded and given some time to explore those ideas with a smaller budget or a small team? And there would be a culture to allow that to happen. Part of that team as well is to coach people through it. So you get people, finance and everything else would get involved early. They would work with them as a partner and kind of try to, you'd have a team to basically do that. But I think there's an aspect of skin in the game to incentivize people to pitch ideas in an organization. And there's also the psychology of ideas are cheap. So unless you've got skin in the game, there's a barrier to be able to materialize ideas because, people will just be throwing things over the fences. From my point of view, even when my background as a consultant, an advisor, should I say, back when I was in professional services, if I would advise or propose anything, I would recommend that I would also be accountable for delivering it because, then you actually live your recommendation. You're held to account for it. So I think there's skin in the game drives a responsibility, which drives quality as well, which is important.
I understand that, let's say, taxonomies in itself have to be hierarchical, but how do you make the process of designing these to be more inclusive, more flat, and therefore maybe is there a good mix between achieving a top-down versus bottom-up development of design portfolios and taxonomies and so on?
Yeah. So I kind of use the ontologies and taxonomies as opposed to just hierarchical aspects. Taxonomies themselves need to be managed. In the absence of them being managed, they get defined and they get lost as an artifact and they don't really get embedded anywhere. If you define a taxonomy and ontologies, then you should embed those into your culture, your recruiting, your training and everything else. And the mechanism should reinforce it. And those taxonomies and ontologies are versions, so they get embedded in all of those things. The other thing is like anything really, I would consider that, which I do, the taxonomies to be a product, which means a product has customers. So you might have owners of the product and the people will be able to manage it, but you have a community and feedback mechanisms around it to evolve it. Nothing's perfect and everything changes all the time. So even if it's good today, it might not be good tomorrow. I would define taxonomies and ontologies as products with customers and treat them as such with open feedback mechanisms and loops and culture so people can contribute. The other advantage of that, of course, is you can build up examples and build up the depth of knowledge because you have the collective intelligence of the many that way.
This is a really critical point of the conversation when you said taxonomies and ontologies have to be. Let's recall a little bit why we in complex portfolios want to have taxonomies and ontologies. And ontologies means essentially, teams sharing a certain description of the domain they are dealing with. Let's say, for example, you have an agricultural company. You may want teams to agree on what is a farmer, what is a harvest, what is a produce, what is transport, and so on. So that the teams can develop different pieces of the product together, and then these pieces can more easily connect. And I think the fact that you said taxonomies and ontologies need to be seen as products, this is fantastic from my point of view, because I remember having a conversation on this very podcast with Alberto Brandolini, one of the most important experts on domain-driven design, and he said agreeing has a cost, so we should be avoiding it if not strictly needed. Okay, so there is this kind of continuous dynamic between imposing a taxonomy and ontology on your product portfolio from the top and looking into what's emerging. And also to kind of add some complexity, we can talk about the role of ecosystems. So again, I want to quote another conversation I had on this podcast with Scott Brinker from HubSpot, where he talked to us about how HubSpot is product scope, let's say, is divided into hubs, and then you have approach to product development that it doesn't really pushes the whole portfolio to the customer, but rather makes a portfolio of products that are easy to connect with. So either as a plugin, as an app, or maybe you can just use the same data format. And so what is your experience as working with customers in terms of how do you build a taxonomy that is, and an ontology that is convenient enough to be used? And also if you can double click a little bit into building open-ended products, which also have a possibility for external parties to plug into.
Yeah. So there's a lot to unpack in there. So a good place to start for me is basically the portfolio. So when you're looking at products across a portfolio, you need to have an objectivity to be able to see like for like, how do things compare of the similar type? And that's really important, because unless you've got that definition, you can't really manage a portfolio. You need to be able to sort of see objectively what those things and how they compare. And then you want to drill down. You want to drill down into those things, and you want to see those relationships, as we mentioned. So it's absolutely critical to basically define that. And that's usually a good place to start. What do we want to see in our portfolio? And let's define that one level. And then you start drilling down, well, what products or platforms or services or modules might actually plug into that? And what's the relationship? How do they interface in that way? You might not want to manage modules at a portfolio level. But the other thing why that's really important, particularly in enterprises, we're talking about innovation, but one of the biggest consumer for me is waste in terms of innovation potential. It's not like a lack of revenue. It's actually waste. Waste is in duplication or underperformance. And I've gone into many companies and they've gone through lots of M&A. I've seen 50 ERPs internally for companies. So the cost of getting information out is so high and they're so abstracted, you can't really make decisions. So you start seeing the secondary symptoms of those causes as soon as you start putting a taxonomy in. The other thing there is, if you want to externalize that, I think there's a distinction between an external and an internal, because I would put a taxonomy into starting at what's the customer facing product. Internally, you would have that as the P&L, the group of the P&L. So the P&L might be a product line, or it might be a business unit. But then there you'd have maybe a product line or products, and the products could be platforms or not, depending on how you define that. But you've got that inheritance and relationship. When you go to external points of view, if like you mentioned HubSpot or so forth, the whole point there is to actually create those interfaces and attributes and the structure for people to be able to operate. So if you have a platform, and a platform you can pull in content, you can pull in modules, you can extend it with apps, you can pull in or develop APIs and everything else. Those are actually interfaces, and those interfaces have rules. So it's really important that you define and version those things, because there's an ecosystem related to those interfaces that needs to be managed when things change. And there's a relationship of inheritance which actually comes in from those different definitions as well. So the failure to actually manage that well is really expensive in terms of cognitive load on the users and the customers, which is something you want to avoid. When you get that really well done, then it becomes instinctive. An example, I don't know if this is helping answer the question, but I believe that we're all inherent taxonomists. If you've got children, I've got a young daughter, one of the first things you teach them is about animals, because you're looking around and they've got a curiosity of the natural world. This is a bird, this is a dog, this is a cat, and then there's different types of birds. Well, that's a taxonomy. And if you think of, to demonstrate how well or inherited we are of taxonomies, I challenge anyone to go to a supermarket. So when you go to a supermarket, guess what? You go to the grocery section and everything's there with the grocery. You go to the vegetables, you might go to the bread section, you might go to the dairy section, you might go to the frozen section. That's a taxonomy. And no one thinks about that as a customer, but you can go into every store with a rough consistency of every store set up that way, and you can navigate to find the products you want very quickly and exit the store. So there's an inherent taxonomy in that. And that's the same when you talk about digital products or other products. You want to make it so instinctive and so simple and so consistent that you're actually, no one has to think too much about it and it becomes almost obvious. But at the same time, you want to optimize it like a product. Like if we use the supermarket example, they got flows through the store which actually maximize, the checkout experience and the buyer, the total cost or the value per customer through the journey through the store, through that taxonomy. So you want to think about that as well in terms of how simple you can make it for people to connect, how natural and intuitive inheritance is, and how well you can objectify the governance and make those comparisons so you can then monitor performance.
I'm getting this strong signal from your side that everything you drive into either a portfolio strategy or your API strategy, your extendability, product extensibility strategy needs to be convenient from the perspective of both the third party, the customer, and so on. So I think this is a very strong signal and something to chew up on and to think through as designers in terms of, sometimes we talk about those standards, we want to position our products as pivotal in the ecosystem, but the question is this convenient? So there needs to be a strong convenient in pushing some kind of taxonomy or structure or modularity or kind of language, whatever, because otherwise systems won't really agree on something, because if there is an implicit cost on agreeing on something. So if there is not an explicit maybe benefit of doing it, it's going to be very hard for both for teams internally or customers to is this capturing what you're trying to say?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I mentioned managing those things as products as well, because it's about the value. I think it's essential, whatever you introduce, governance and taxonomy could be seen as governance. But is what is it you're trying to solve, and how do you do that in a way which minimizes it? And it could be, a taxonomy. It could be trying to solve, clarity in the portfolio, so you've got objectivity. But it could also be so everyone knows where they are in the system and how they connect to other people in the system, so they can see themselves within the system. You need to make that as simple and inherent and instinctive as possible, because if you think of it this way, the absence of it increases complexity or even a state of chaos potentially. But once you have it, things can operate more in a fluid manner. So I mentioned earlier, Amazon's a large company, and we have, cultural tenets, and we have mechanisms. And we don't have prescriptive frameworks in many ways, because we use interfaces as small teams. So we know quite well which team owns what, and how to interface with every team is very clear. Who makes decisions is very clear, because we have single-threaded leadership. So it's very clear where you go if you've got an issue, or if you need something, who can help you and how you can interface with those things. And I think when you're scaling, that's essential. Otherwise, you're going to be increasing cognitive load and complexity substantially.
I think this helps us also get a rounded opinion on how to approach building and implementing taxonomies, right? Is there maybe something we missed touching upon from our side that you'd like to probably highlight for our listeners? Or if not, you can also share maybe some breadcrumbs or suggestions, as we call it, from our side for maybe books or podcasts that have inspired your journey as well.
Yeah. Well, I've enjoyed the conversation, so I hope we've covered a lot of things, I think, well in what we've explored. I guess what I would share is one of the things I find I draw my inspiration from, although I'm kind of in a product and technology world, is bio-mimicry. So when I look at sort of teams, for instance, and the structure of teams, I read a lot of biology and biomimicry, and I draw inspiration maybe because it's abstract from resources outside the field. So if you look at like a cell, a cell is pretty consistent in size. When, if you go through meiosis or mitosis, the cell splits and it creates another cell the same size. And I liken that to how you create teams. You have in Amazon, we have 2 pizza teams. When the team gets too big, we split the team into another thing. So they roughly stay the same size, and then there's common interfaces. So I like to draw a lot of inspiration from biology. Taxonomies, if this might be too much information, but I love actually going through the history of biological taxonomies, Carl Linnaeus and people like that, because it's quite interesting when you look at the natural world, how they look at taxonomies. And over time, as we've kind of got more advanced in DNA and things like that, how it's challenged some of the taxonomies, and then how it's used. So I always find that quite important, and I'm not expecting everyone to share my passion on that. But if you're interested in taxonomies, I would strongly suggest looking at the biological structures, and biology is a prerequisite there. The other things around, there's, I draw a great inspiration from, product conferences and leadership conferences. I try to actually go to different sort of fields. So one of the things I try to do is avoid going to the same types of conferences all the time. So I might go to financial conferences, HR conferences, not just technology conferences, because it gives me different perspectives, and I'm able to engage with different functions and empathize with the challenges they have, and build bridges in different domain languages. I can follow up with some links if that's of use as well to anyone on the readers, but that's where I draw my inspiration from.
Thank you so much. Your link will be welcome, and this also leads me to say that our listeners will be able to check the show notes on boundaryless.io/resources/podcast, where they will find your episode and the others that we have been running in the last 4 years now. So check the show notes. And that was a great conversation. And I think overall, we touched upon so many great topics. I want to just double click in the last thing you said, this bio-mimicry perspective is really interesting, and I started to think through ideas like product species and symbiosis between products instead of bundles, and ecosystem of products with maybe some leading species and the others. So it's really, really very interesting also to see how you can entertain both a pragmatic approach, like, when you said think taxonomies and ontologies as products, and on the other side, keeping this complexity mindset in your work. So thank you so much for sharing both of these kind of energies in the conversation. So thank you so much, Shruti. It was great to have you on the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks, Simone. And thank you, Craig, for joining us today. It was great talking to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Craig. It was great to have you.
Thanks for inviting me. We enjoyed it.
For our listeners, until we speak again, remember to think boundaryless.